Chapter 17, Part 2 is the development of Russia. This is the story of Russian absolutism and the growth of the Kingdom of Russia. And we have not yet heard anything about Russia in this class. This is the first time that we're going to learn about the Russian people and get a little bit of the background from the Middle Ages, but focus mainly on the first major absolute monarchs who are known in Russia as the Tsars, T-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. The Romanovs is their family dynasty, and their story sort of parallels what happens in Western Europe, with some interesting differences. So, first thing, when you think about Russia, it's so massive. Just let's look at the map here. The territory that is known as Russia used to be very, very small and only around the city of Moscow. And so find that on the map here. It's the light purple. So as we pick up the story in like 1462, as we'll see, it's actually quite small. The story of Russia is the story of expansion. And as you see over the centuries, not very many, 2 or 3 centuries, Russia becomes this massive country. And in fact, it's the most large, physically, geographically country on the map today. And it was beginning to that point a long time ago. The most significant expansion is going to be under the leader named Peter the Great. We'll get to him in a minute. But it starts off small but steady and grows quite dramatically. So the question is Russia really European or Asian? Because it covers both continents, and this is a favorite question that people have been asking for centuries. The famous British Prime Minister during World War II named Winston Churchill used to say, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, because the history of Russia is very complicated. The people of Russia are complicated. The geography is complicated. The language is complicated. And Russia, just to give you kind of the main point here, has never really had a golden age. They've never had a period of history where things went really well and there was a lot of advancement and a lot of democracy or a lot of prosperity. There's been periods of advancement, but you'll see they're accompanied by pain, death, forced labor. That's kind of the nature of Russian society, is really difficult. And it goes from bad sometimes to worse. Some of the worst periods of Russian history are only in the last 70, 80 years under Stalin and his successors and communism. So all of what we're learning about today, just keep in mind that this points us toward the 20th century, where Russia became a communist nation during World War I by Vladimir Lenin. And then it was ruled like that for 70 years, Lenin, Stalin, all the way up communist until 1991. So the history that we start today has a long story that follows it. All right, so here's some things about Russia that are, similar to Western Europe. So is Russia Asian or European? Well, it's both. But the things that looked a little bit like Western Europe is that there was one dominant religion for most of Russian history, and that's called Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox. And much like the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe, the Eastern Orthodox Church is the church for most of Russian history. So that's kind of similar. Another thing that's common between Europe and Russia is that they both have nobles. Russian nobility are known as boyars, all right? And then the third thing in common that you could add here is that in both societies there are lots and lots of peasants. Most people are poor and farmers and unskilled and get mostly manipulated throughout history. So that's another similarity here, all right? So the early beginnings of Russian history are known as the Mongol yoke, the period of the Mongol yoke. This is from 1250 to 1450, 200 years. And you'll notice that's before any of these territorial acquisitions are on the map. And that's because Russia was ruled by the Mongols. And the first and most important, or maybe not first, but most important Mongol leader is Genghis Khan, Khan, and his army known as the Golden Horde. And from 1250 to 1450, these Asian invaders from Mongolia conquered Russia, what we know as Russia today, by military conquest, all right? It's Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, and these guys are brutal. They treated the Russians brutally, harshly, like slaves, essentially. They used anybody that was Russian. They had to work for the service of the Mongol Empire. So anybody that was a Russian noble or a prince got used as a tax collector or a servant. Okay, excuse me. The princes of Moscow were these independent guys that had been around for several hundred years, going back to the Middle Ages, the real Middle Ages, and they got conquered by the Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde. And the point here is that over time, the princes of little tiny Moscow, just the city itself, began to work within this Mongol system to gain a foothold, gain some power. And the Russian guys are always named Ivan. Remember, the Prussian guys are always Frederick. Okay, the French guys are all going to be Louis, and the English are Charles and James, and the Russians are always Ivan. All right, that's a lot of Ivans. So the Russian princes, you got the Ivan, the guy named Ivan the Moneybags, and Ivan the Third. Here's a little game you can play. Look at the screen. Which guy is which? Oop. Wait a minute. They are pretty much the same guy, huh? Art was not a strong point in Russian society at this point. These guys become tax collectors for the Mongols, and they get really rich, okay? And they crush rebellions among fellow Russians against the Mongols. They're like, they're kind of dirty. They turn on their own people. They crush their own people in order to get rewarded by the Mongols, and they get promoted and paid. And then eventually, these princes of Moscow are going to overthrow the Mongols. So it's very Machiavellian, huh? These guys are not messing around. Here's another main theme of Russian history to put up at the top of the notes. We already said there's no golden age, and every period of Russian history is kind of rough, and it doesn't seem to ever get better. Or if it does, it comes at a huge price. The second theme of Russian history is that they're always behind. They're always trying to catch up with the West or catch up with Europe. And it starts right here because they were ruled where most of Europe was in the Middle Ages. Cities are being built. They're coming out of the Dark Ages. The Renaissance is happening right in 1450. So right as these Ivans are ruling, Western Europe's in the Renaissance. These guys are being still dominated by these foreign invaders, and there is no Renaissance in in Russia. And there's really not going to be much of an enlightenment there either. It's brief, but then it goes away. So they're missing out on these cultural developments that are happening in the rest of Europe. So they always feel like they're behind. And then when it comes time to catch up, it usually comes with a lot of trouble and pain for people of the lower classes in the process. All right? So over time, these princes of Moscow became known as czars, and you can spell that 4 different ways. And they're going to eventually overthrow the Mongols, and they're going to establish what's known as autocracy. That's a fancy way of saying rule by one person, dictatorship, or absolute monarchy. So even the Russians are doing this, but they use the word in Russian history, autocracy. That's the key word. They stopped acknowledging the Mongol Khan as the supreme ruler, and their identity became very much connected to their Eastern Orthodox faith. So as over time, these princes of Moscow, the Ivans, became sort of the rulers of that city-state, tossed out the Mongols, and created a new identity for themselves and their people. But here's where it starts to go south, and it gets continually worse. The Russian princes, the czars, ultimately, immediately put their nobles into service. It's called service nobility. And the nobles of Russia get land bought from the czar in exchange for military service. So you have to, in order to keep the land that you have as a Russian boyar, noble, you have to serve the czar for life. This is the deal. This is the bargain. And this is like feudalism. This is what had been happening in Europe, but was going away at this point. It's actually getting stronger in Eastern Europe and particularly in Russia. So the most important of these first czars is a guy named Ivan the Terrible. And it means Ivan the Great, really, or like the word terrible is sort of a bad Russian translation, but an interesting guy. The guy, look at this picture. You might not have wanted to run into him on the street. But Ivan the Terrible, here's a little bit about him from the book, his biography. He ascended the throne at age 3, He suffered insults and neglect at the hands of the Russian boyars who raised him after his mother mysteriously died, possibly poisoned, when he was just 8. At age 16, he suddenly pushed aside his hated boyar advisors in an awe-inspiring ceremony complete with gold coins pouring down on his head. He majestically crowned himself and officially took the title of Tsar for the first time. So he's really the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan the Terrible. Interesting guy. Service nobility under Ivan the Terrible became much worse. Okay, all nobles, old and new, had to serve the Tsar in order to hold any land, and they had to serve him for life. He continued to wage war against the Mongols and ultimately defeated them. He waged a reign of terror against the boyars, the nobles of Russia. A little bit more from the book on this. Leading boyars, their relatives, and even their peasants and servants were executed en masse by a special corps of unquestioning servants. Dressed in black and riding black horses, they were forerunners of the modern dictator's secret police. Large estates were confiscated, broken up, and reapportioned to different people. Incredible. So he waged this reign of terror against anyone that might threaten him, particularly the boyars. Also, another group opposing Ivan the Terrible, who he's going to dominate, is this group called the Cossacks. Cossacks are these Russian peasants who have military training. They're like knights. They're like medieval knights, and they live at the edges of Russian society geographically. And he was trying to conquer them, and they're always trying to fight back against him. So it's like these rural, armed, skilled on horseback peasants who are constantly battling the czars of Russia as they try to expand into their territory. Remember, the Russians are expanding, and they're coming up against these Cossacks in the process. In terms of the economic situation of Russia, he took over all businesses, the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. Royal monopolization. Everything is owned by the Tsar. There is no private industry. There is no middle class because there is no business owners. It's all property of the Tsar. This sounds like the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, where everything was controlled by the Sultan. All slaves, all people are slaves of the prince, of the Tsar, who is Ivan the Terrible. He's like the founding father of Russia, basically. Imagine if George Washington, our founding father, had treated the people of early United States kind of like this. We would have a very different history. This sets up Russian history for a lot of future trouble. All right, he died in 1598, and he was replaced by his son, who also quickly died, and there's a time of troubles. The death of Ivan the Terrible causes this time of troubles where there's civil war and invasions by the Cossacks, and this is this period for 15 years of just upheaval. And the Cossacks are rebelling and trying to, take back land, and they're calling for a new leader of some kind. And the boyar nobles rallied at this point and crushed the peasants, crushed the Cossacks, and had a little vote. And they said, we need a strong leader. This sounds familiar. We need, like in Western Europe, there's all these religious wars, and now the absolute monarchs are going to come in and deal with that. Same thing, except minus the religious wars. Lots of civil war in the East, in Russia, and these nobles are going to pick a new hereditary czar. And the dynasty name and the first guy's names you got to know is Michael Romanov, or Romanov. And there he is. This is the second major Russian Tsar, but the first to come from the Romanov dynasty. And this dynasty is going to rule Russia for 304 years, all the way down into World War I, until the 20th century, the Romanovs. They're big. And they completely enslaved the peasants of Russia by 1650. Enserfed, really, is the word. To be enserfed is to be enslaved. So there you go. Second Tsar of Russia, but the first Romanov. There's also Cossack rebellions continually at this point against the new Romanov dynasty. And one of the most famous Cossack peasant rebellions is led by a guy named Stenka Razin, who we will affectionately call Stinky Raisin from this point forward. Looks like a pretty handsome guy, actually. But he was this radical Cossack guy, okay, leading these incredible, massive rebellions against the Russians. Amazing. Let me give you some stats here. This is in 1670 and 71. Stenka Razin attract a great army of urban poor and peasants, killing landlords and government officials and proclaiming freedom from oppression. All right. Of course it's defeated. They always are. Peasant rebellions never work. Crushed, and in response, the thoroughly scared upper classes tighten the screws of serfdom. Even more, holding down the peasants, maintaining the czar becomes the task of the Russian government at this point. So that's it. Stenka Razin, flash in the pan, gave it a shot, burned. Doesn't make it. Section D, the reforms of Peter the Great. All that leads up to this. Here's the main man of the hour, all right? Peter the Great is the most significant czar of Russian history in the early years, and he is the guy that's going to be most associated with absolute monarchy and modernizing Russia and really bringing him into prominence with the West, okay? Physically, he was this giant man. He was 6'7". He was just this beast. He stood out in a crowd. He has this physical, presence. And his goals for Russia were military power and territorial expansion. And so he rules 1682 to 1725. Look at what happens under that time frame on the map here. 1682 is the light orange, up to 1725 is the dark orange. He nearly tripled the size of Russia by conquering Mongolia and Siberia and all this stuff. Plus, he conquers some land from Sweden, which we're going to see here in a minute, over by St. Petersburg, which is a brand new city. So incredible success here. He starts off his rule, actually, by wanting to learn about the West. He goes, Russia's behind. I know it. And he wanted to go on this tour. He took all these Russian nobles with him, the boyars, and they all went and on this 18-month visit, almost like tourists to Western Europe. And he dressed incognito. People didn't know he was the Tsar. He wore regular clothes like the nobles. He never stood out. They didn't know who he was, so he kind of blended in. And when he wanted to go see, the economy of Western Europe, shipbuilding, he wanted to study the armies of Western Europe, and so he went to England. He went to the Netherlands. He went and he wanted to work with his hands. He would go work, at the docks, and he'd work with shipbuilders, and he wanted to physically himself learn how to have a modern Western-style nation. They called this his Great Embassy. Write that term down, the Grand Embassy, where he visited these countries, okay, and he's particularly impressed with England and the Dutch because they were the richest, they were the most internationally prominent, the governments were the most stable, the fleets of ships were the best, so these are the countries he wanted to imitate, and it was amazing. This is a great story in history, him going undercover, kind of, learning secretly about Western Europe. All right, he had to cut his trip short and come back home because he had a war against Sweden to fight. Sweden is the main enemy of Russia at this point. And why? They're fighting over port cities or potential port cities, all right? And the first round of the Great Swedish Wars was won by Sweden. But that's not going to last for long, all right? Peter the Great is going to then initiate a lot of reforms in Russian society. These are all kind of important. The goals are to increase state power and strengthen the army. Okay, his goal is to bring Russia into the modern age by any means necessary. Forced modernization. Write this down somewhere else on the margin. Got to get ahead. Got to catch up. This is the theme of Russian history. All right, what does he do then? He's going to make the term of service for nobles even longer. Serve for life. Okay, how do you go longer than that? You can't. Serve the Tsar for life. He created schools and universities to create technical experts so that the people would become engineers and know how to build ships and weaponry. So it's all about modernization. He required that all nobles in Russia had to be educated for at least 5 years. So he forced them to go to school. He established a new military and civilian bureaucracy. So these are government officials loyal to the king. It's just like the intendant system of France. He said that the people in the bureaucracy are promoted based on their merit, based on your talent and your accomplishment, not being a nobleman. He also welcomed foreigners, anyone that had a skill that was from another country. He said, come on in, we'll give you a great salary, and we want to learn from you. So he welcomed all these foreign engineers and craftsmen so that they could teach the Russian people how to have these things that they didn't have. He built a standing army. This is just like everybody in Europe at the time, composed mainly of peasants who served for life. And the army numbered 200,000 peasants. So this is all very rapid modernization. He raised taxes on peasants, and he increased forced labor on peasants. So I said they're going to modernize, but at a tremendous cost. And that's the theme of Russian history. So what happens to serfdom under Peter the Great? It got much, much worse. You know he wasn't going to let those Swedes get away with winning round one of the war. He really wanted the area right around where you see St. Petersburg, the city on this map, that little orange, dark orange. He wanted that. He goes, I want a port. I want access to the sea, to the Baltic Sea. And the Swedes controlled that at that point. And he had to fight them for it because he wanted to have a navy, a world-class navy. And you got to have a port to have a navy. And look at the rest of Russia. You can't have something up in the Arctic. It's frozen over all the time. He needed a warm water, relatively warm water port. So he's going to fight Sweden. It's called the Great Northern War. 21 years, Russia versus Sweden, and Russia picked up the victory under Peter the Great. As such, he annexed territories that used to be part of Sweden, Estonia, and Latvia. This is right around where it says Novgorod. So he took some territory from the Swedes, and this is a major event. Russia became a great European power at this point. When you defeat Sweden, who, remember, Sweden was a big player in the 30 Years' War, they were a powerful empire, and they were, Protestant and modern. We don't learn much about Swedish history, but they were doing great at this point, and the Russians are an upstart country, and they have this incredible victory against a powerful country, and it really makes a difference. They're a great European power at this point. And Russia begins to westernize under Peter the Great. He's going to bring in architects from Western Europe. He's going to bring in artists. He wants engineers and anyone with a skill, as I said, and he's going to force cultural and artistic and military changes in Russia modeled on France and England and the Netherlands particularly. Those are the countries he liked the most. So culturally, he's going to make the people of Russia dress a different way. You have to start dressing like a Frenchman. He wouldn't let them have their beards anymore. Look at these guys. They were always interested in beards. Look at these guys. The Ivans. Having a beard was a big deal. This was part of Russian identity. Look at Ivan the Terrible's beard. He goes, you got to shave your beards. This is not what a modern man looks. This is what a modern man looks like. You have a nice, clean-shaven face, maybe a mustache. You dress like a Westerner. This is what you do. All right, so incredible dictated changes from top down to modernize the people of Russia. Well, we'll read some stuff in class that shows you even more about this. All right, so that's Peter the Great. Here's another picture of him on a little amulet or something like that. So this is Russia under Peter the Great, modernized, picked up some great military victories, and they're on their way to some greatness, but at tremendous cost. The last section in this chapter is called Absolutism and Baroque Architecture, and this is pretty much set in Eastern Europe now. Once these people like Peter the Great are in power, they start building these palaces and cities to rival the West. And it's all about power. Baroque art was all about power and emotion, and it's establishing a dominance. And you remember that it was originally used by the Catholic Church, of course, in the Counter-Reformation to win over followers and win back the lost. So there's always been an emotional, overwhelming, theatrical aspect to Baroque art. And that is what the Russians pick up on and go, yes, we need to use that for our benefit too. It's about overawing the subjects. And everything you do is always going to be built like the Palace of Versailles. All of the physical structures, the cities, the palaces, we always use Louis XIV and Versailles from this point on as the model. All right, here's some examples. So I'll show you the Russian stuff at the end, but let's start with other parts of, the Habsburgs got to have this too. Everyone's got to do this. This is the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, the home base of the Holy Roman Emperors of the Habsburg dynasty in Austria. This was built around 1700. Even remember the Swedish here that we just saw losing to the Russians. They had to have a little piece of the action too. Yeah, this is the Royal Palace in Stockholm. Okay, and even little princes want a little miniature Versailles. So Eugene of Savoy, who was the main guy that helped defeat the French in the War of Spanish Succession. He was an Austrian prince. he was paid a great sum of money, of course, for his work in the war, and so he wants a palace. This is called the Belvedere Palace, and it's outside of Vienna. So all across Eastern Europe, there's like this palace building craze of all the people that are wanting to be absolute monarchs, and they're all copying the French. Entire cities are created like this in Eastern Europe. Oh, don't forget, there's one more here. This is Sanssouci in Berlin. This is the royal palace of the Hohenzollerns. Yeah, this is theirs. This is from Prussia. So they got one too. Everyone has one. All right, whole cities are constructed in Eastern Europe now. They're all about royal power, royal magnificence, centralization, physical cities built to reflect new absolute monarchs in Eastern Europe. This is Karlsruhe in would have been Prussia at the time, Germany today. All power radiates from the center of this city. Look at this circle with the royal palace in the middle, and everything is like spokes coming out from the middle of it. Everything is meant to have a physical presence showing the power of these new rulers. Big avenues, broad avenues, okay? You want big streets, not only because they're beautiful, but because if you have a rebellion on your hand, your troops can move quickly to suppress rebellion on large, wide open streets than if they're caught in like a tangle of little back streets and alleys somewhere. So there's these artistic motives, but also power motives, okay? Big government buildings are part of these new cities in Eastern Europe. Big department stores, fancy schmancy department stores, modernizing. They're all trying to look like the West, okay? Like Paris, let's say. This is all a theme. And the pace of life increases. The pace of life as there's carriages running on these streets. They're modernizing top down, forced modernization. That's the theme. All right, let's talk about St. Petersburg, the last little bit of the story here. This is the new capital city of Russia. It was nothing. It was a swamp. Peter the Great conquered this land from Sweden in the Great Northern War, and he goes, I want my port city, and I want my new capital city, and it's going to be built from scratch. And that's St. Petersburg. And he named it after St. Peter from the Bible, but it happened to coordinate with his own name, which was also Peter. So believe me, that was part of the action. This is big. This was again, a warm water port. You want to put a navy here. You want to build a modern navy, and it needs a home base. So this is St. Petersburg, and it's going to replace Moscow as the capital city. I'll go back to the map so we can just kind of get a sense of where we're talking here. Moscow was the old capital. It'll be again in the future. Today the capital of Russia is Moscow, but it's going to move once he builds this new city up on the Baltic Sea, St. Petersburg. It's a brand new city. Of course, the way he built it was not going to be nice. You know that. It's going to be a window on Europe. That's what he said. That's the term you need to know. A window on Europe so I can see the West and be physically close to it. It's going to be a Western city. He wanted it to look like Paris or London or Amsterdam, okay? Very modern. And it had to have detailed regulations. He wanted canals in it that looked like maybe the Netherlands. Certain neighborhoods were going to be for nobility, certain neighborhoods for the poor. Everyone would be segregated and isolated according to their social class. It was like a master planned community. You may have heard of these, up in like Oro Valley, there's all these master planned communities with a golf course here and all that. It's where the houses are. Same thing. It's a master planned city. All right, and everyone lives in separate parts of it because we don't mix like that. Picture here is his royal palace. It's called the Winter Palace. We'll come back to it here in a minute. How was this city built? It was built with forced labor, as you can probably imagine. He required anywhere from 25 to 40,000 peasants from all across Russia to come to the building site of St. Petersburg every summer and work on the city without pay. Forced labor built St. Petersburg, so the peasants provided the labor and the nobles provided the finances for it. It was built on a breakneck pace by forced labor. And the reactions, you can imagine, were not so great. People don't like being forced to build what they don't want to do. Again, 25 to 40,000 peasants. People hated the forced labor. Each year, 1/4 to 1/3 of those who had to come risked brutal punishment and ran away. Every 10 to 15 peasant households had to furnish one worker each summer and then pay a special tax in order to feed the worker that got sent to St. Petersburg to build the city. I mean, you talk about rebellion. It's like conscription. You're forced in. Amazing. It was the building of St. Petersburg was like a huge tax levied on all members of Russian society. The nobles paid for it, and the peasants physically built it. So people hated this place. They hated the new city. It's gorgeous, though. Look at this. It looks just like Western Europe. It's beautifully designed with architecture and royal palaces and churches. It's just look at this. This is classical style. This is the square called Palace Square in front of the royal palace for Peter the Great. It's got columns and arches and all of this. It's just a magnificent city. Very, very cool. He hired Italian architects to come and to build it. This is the royal palace. This is the square in front, and this is the palace itself. It's beautiful. It looks like Versailles. It's green. He hired this architect named Rastrelli from Italy to come and build Baroque palaces for him. And this continued under the subsequent Russian dynasties. The Winter Palace is the most important building that you need to know. It's the equivalent of Versailles. Look at this thing. It's pretty magnificent. And today it's an art museum, the most important art museum in Russia. This is another palace. This is the Winter Palace. This is the Summer Palace. You got to have each because it's too cold in the winter, too warm and then in the summer you want to go be on the coast. So this is up a little bit out of St. Petersburg on the coast, so you can sail in the summer, and it's just gorgeous. Look at all the fountains. It looks just like Versailles with that canal running out the backyard. It's only about a quarter as big as Versailles, not nearly as big, but it looks almost like an exact copy. Spitting gold fish on your front lawn. That says absolutism, if you ask me. All right, by 1782, the population of Russia was 300,000 strong, relatively small compared to other nations, but they've established a strong absolute monarchy under Peter the Great and started imitating Western society. Look, here's another one of these. You got to have a yellow one, a green one, and a blue one. These are all over Russia. They had these palaces built for the Russian dynasty. No wonder why the people of Russia down the road are going to rebel against the czars. When you live like this, you're just asking for it. All right, that's Eastern Europe. That's absolutism. Chapter 17 is all done. Bye-bye.